Okay, so in this video, we will be focusing on the pituitary gland, okay, which is still under the endocrine system. In fact, the pituitary gland is what we refer to as the master gland of the endocrine system. Okay, you remember that when we were looking at the hypothalamus, I mentioned that the hypothalamus is not the master gland. The hypothalamus is the master regulator. Is that okay? Or the head ganglion. But the pituitary gland is referred to as the master gland. Is that okay? Good. You can also call the pituitary gland the hypophysis gland or hypophysis. Okay, so the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis, but it is often referred to as the master gland. Why is it the master gland? It's a master gland because the pituitary gland controls the activities of many other endocrine glands. Okay, good. In terms of the pituitary gland is about 1.3 centimeters in its diameter. Is that okay? If you look at the length is about 5 to 9 millimeters, but then it can vary with age, with sex, and then with the person's or the individual's hormonal status. Okay, the width of the pituitary gland is about 10 to 15 mm. Okay, and then the anterior posterior diameter or the diameter is about 6 to 8 mm or 1.3 centimeters in diameter. Okay, so basically that is more like some anatomical details of the pituitary gland in terms of the size of the pituitary gland. Okay, and another thing is that it is about 1.3 centimeters in diameter, enlarging by up to 50% during pregnancy, and is located at the base of the brain. It is housed in a bony cavity called the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Okay, the pituitary gland is actually suspended from the hypothalamus by a stalk known as the infundibulum, forming a critical connection in the neuroendocrine system. Okay, so this is what we are talking about. Is that okay? So you see, it is suspended by the hypothalamus. Is that okay? By the infundibulum. Is that okay? So this region is what we are referring to as the infundibulum. Okay, so here is the hypothalamus. Okay, and it is suspended by the hypothalamus by this region, the infundibulum. That is what we are talking about. Okay, so the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis gland. So anytime we mention hypophysis gland, hypophysis, we are talking about the pituitary gland. Okay, hypophysis because it is located beneath the hypothalamus. You see, it is located just beneath the hypothalamus. Okay, or inferior to the hypothalamus. That's why we are referring to it as the hypophysis gland. Okay, and it is often referred to as the master gland. Why? Because it controls the activities of many other endocrine glands. Okay, good. And it is suspended by the hypothalamus from the hypothalamus by a stalk known as the infundibulum, forming a critical connection in the neuroendocrine system. Okay, so this is what we are referring to. So this region, okay, this region, okay, so it is suspended by this region. This region is what we are referring to as the infundibulum here. You see it's labeled clearly over here, the infundibulum. Is that okay? Good. Now, this gland has two major parts. The pituitary gland, like we mentioned, which we even discussed during the hypothalamus. This gland actually has two parts. Okay, the two parts, we have the anterior pituitary gland and then we have the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is also called the ADENOHYPOPHYSIS gland. ADENOHYPOPHYSIS gland. And the posterior pituitary gland is also referred to as the NEUROHYPOPHYSIS gland. Okay, ADENOHYPOPHYSIS gland and then the NEUROHYPOPHYSIS gland. Okay, now the anterior pituitary, why do we call it ADENOHYPOPHYSIS gland? In fact, it is called ADENOHYPOPHYSIS gland because that gland is connected to the hypothalamus by blood vessels. And then why do we call this one neurohypophysis gland, because this gland, the posterior pituitary, is connected to the hypothalamus by a nerve fiber or neuron. Is that okay? So the posterior pituitary connects to the hypothalamus. So this is what we call. Okay, so here is it. So you see, this is the posterior pituitary. Okay, this is the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, and this is the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, the posterior pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, if you look at it over here to clear, this is the posterior pituitary gland. This is the anterior pituitary gland. So you could see that there is a nerve fiber over here. Okay, so the hypothalamus actually connects to the posterior pituitary via the nerve fiber or the nerve fibers. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, connects to the hypothalamus using blood vessels. So you see the blood vessels, all of them channels here, but we don't have any of the blood vessels here. Is that okay? If you look at it over here, you see there are nerve fibers connecting we have nerve fibers connecting the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? So we have nerve fibers actually connecting the posterior pituitary. And that is the reason why. So there is a neural connection. We say that there is a neural connection between the hypothalamus and then the posterior pituitary. A neural connection. That is why we call it the neurohypophysis gland. Neurohypophysis. Okay. Neurohypophysis. Okay. So the posterior pituitary actually connects to the hypothalamus using nerve fibers. So there are two nerve fibers. Different nerve fibers. Okay, depending on which hormone that it is. So you see over here in the hypothalamus, there are some two hormones. There are several hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, which we've discussed already. But there are two particular hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, but they are actually transported via these two different nerve fibers. Okay, and then these nerve fibers, their axon terminals are within, or their axon terminals are based within the posterior pituitary, and so they are released into the posterior pituitary to be stored over there. Is that okay? That is why we say this particular part of the pituitary gland is called neurohypophysis gland. Is that okay? Neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary gland. So remember that the posterior pituitary gland connects to the hypothalamus using nerve fibers or neurons. So there is a neural connection between the hypothalamus and then the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, whilst we have blood vessels connecting. Take note, this is not a blood vessel. This is a neuron connecting there. So these are two neurons, because see, we are talking about two different hormones, oxytocin, okay, and then this one is also for the antidiuretic hormone. So they are all nerve fibers. So when the oxytocin is produced over here within the cells in the hypothalamus, they are transported along the axons to the axon terminals, and the axon terminals are based in the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary do not produce, it's like a storage gland. So it releases oxytocin and then antidiuretic hormone, but they are not produced there. Is that okay? They are not produced there. That's what you should understand. You should understand the difference. They are produced in the hypothalamus and they are transported to be stored here. The same thing applies to the oxytocin. This neuron or nerve fiber is for the oxytocin. So it's produced over here, then it's transported along the axon to the axon terminals, which are in the posterior pituitary, to be stored over here. Is that okay? But then for the anterior pituitary gland, they are actually, they actually produce their own hormones. So the hormones over there are produced over there under the stimulation of hormones from the hypothalamus. Is that okay? Good. So basically, that is it. So you see, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is at the superior part over here, the hypothalamus. Is that okay? Then we have the superior hypophyseal artery. So we have a blood vessel that connects. We have blood vessels connecting, okay, the hypophyseal portal system, which is made up of veins, the hypophyseal portal veins. They actually connect the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. Is that okay? Good. So basically, Basically, that is it. Okay, so you realize that this gland consists of two major parts: the adenohypophysis gland, or the anterior pituitary, and the neurohypophysis gland, or the posterior pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary produces 6 major hormones and makes up about 75% of the gland. It includes the pars distalis, which is the main hormone secretory organ, and then the pars tuberalis, which wraps around the stalk. Then the neurohypophysis, on the other hand, is composed of nerve fibers and neuroglial cells. It stores and releases hormones produced in the hypothalamus, that is specifically antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, but does not produce them by itself. So like I said, this posterior pituitary, no hormone is produced over here, but it stores the hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus and transported to be stored in the posterior pituitary. So in anatomy and physiology, we say that they release. Okay, they store and release, but they do not produce. Okay, so if you are asked where oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are produced, it's in the hypothalamus. But if you are asked where they are released, then posterior pituitary. Where they are stored, then posterior pituitary. Is that okay? Good. And that part of the pituitary gland, this part of the pituitary gland is the smallest. The posterior pituitary is the smallest. Okay, so the anterior pituitary produces 6 major hormones and makes up 75% of the pituitary gland. So that should tell you, looking at the whole pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary is the largest. Okay, it makes up 75% of the gland. Is that okay? Good. So the gland also has 2 parts: the main hormone secretory region. Okay, so this is what we are talking about. So this is the main hormone, the pituitary gland itself. So you see, this is the main hormone secretory region. And then the region that actually, because these are the areas where the cells that secrete, especially for the anterior pituitary. You know, the posterior pituitary do not have cells that produce any hormone. Is that? But you see, the anterior pituitary have hormone producing cells. Okay, so this gland is basically made up of the parts where the hormones are produced. Is that okay? This is what we are talking about. So the main hormone secreting region, which is this region here. Is that okay? And then the stalk. Okay, the pars tuberalis. Okay, which wraps around the stalk. Is that okay? That is basically what we are talking about. So this is what we are talking about. Okay, so this is what we are talking about. The pars tuberalis. So this part is what we call the pars tuberalis. And then the stalk. This part is what we call the stalk. Okay. This part is what we call the stalk. All right. So let's continue. Okay, so this is also a diagram of the pituitary gland anatomy. So you see the hypothalamus over here. Then it is hanged by the infundibulum. So this is the infundibulum. Is that okay? And we mentioned that this gland basically has about 2-3 parts. So we have 2 parts. So we have this part called the pars tuberalis. So this is the pars tuberalis. This part. Is that okay? This part is what we call the pars tuberalis. Okay, and then the main hormone secreting part is what we call the pars distalis. So this part is what we call the pars distalis. Okay, this part. If you come over here to this part is what we call the pars distalis, more like the main body of the anterior pituitary itself is the pars distalis. Then the region between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, there is a demarcation there. We call it the pars intermedia. The pars intermedia. Okay, the pars intermedia. So the pars intermedia is between the anterior pituitary and then the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? The anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the immediate border is called the median eminence. The immediate border to where from there we have the infundibulum is called the median eminence. Okay, the median eminence. Is that okay? And you can see clearly that the optic chiasm is closer to is just inferior or closer to the hypothalamus. These are all anatomical regions that you can use when you are describing the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland. Is that okay? So basically that is it. So now you know the parts of the anterior pituitary. They pass to varalis, okay, which is just this part, right after the infundibulum. And then we have the pars intermedia, the region between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Then the pars distalis, which is more like the main body of the anterior pituitary. Okay. Then for the posterior pituitary too, we have the infundibular stalk, which is basically this part, the infundibular stalk, and then the pars nervosa, the infundibular stalk, which is basically this region, and then we have the pars nervosa. Is that okay? Good. So the posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis is composed of nerve fibers and neuroglial cells. It stores and releases hormones produced in the hypothalamus, but does not produce them itself. Now, the anterior pituitary is controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. And you remember that we mentioned that the hypothalamus actually controls the activities of the pituitary gland. So in fact, all the hormones produced in the hypothalamus, they go to regulate the activity. That's why we call it the master regulator. Okay, so imagine a gland that regulates a master. Okay, because the pituitary gland is the master gland. And we have another gland that regulates its activity. So you can call that gland master gland. That gland is the master regulator. That's how come the hypothalamus is rather called the master regulator. Is that okay? So we have releasing and inhibiting hormones, which we've done already. So we have releasing and inhibiting hormones produced by the hypothalamus, which regulates the activities of the pituitary gland, especially the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so the anterior pituitary gland is controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus, delivered through a specialized blood system called the hypophyseal portal system. The hypophyseal portal system is the portal system that actually links the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. That system, that transport system connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary is what we call the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, good. And that portal system is via blood vessels, okay, the veins. Now, the posterior pituitary receives hormones directly from the hypothalamic neurons via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract and releases them into the bloodstream upon neural stimulation. Is that okay? Now, hormones secreted by the pituitary gland include the follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, adenocorticotrophic hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, okay, the antidiuretic hormone, and then oxytocin. So these are the anterior pituitary hormones. So the follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, adenocorticotrophic hormone, growth hormone, and then prolactin. These are the anterior pituitary hormones. You should know the distinction clear, so that if we ask you, okay, the following are parts of hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, except, or the following hormones are released from the anterior pituitary, except, if you see oxytocin, you know oxytocin is not released from there. If you see ADH, antidiuretic hormone, you know antidiuretic hormone is not released from there. In fact, antidiuretic hormone is not even produced in the posterior pituitary. But if the question is concentrating or focusing on release, then that is fine. Is that okay? So antidiuretic hormone and then oxytocin, these are the posterior pituitary hormones. And then follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adenocorticotrophic hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, these are the anterior pituitary hormones. Is that okay? So it's more like the hormones produced in the hypothalamus, the releasing and inhibiting hormones, they would go and control the activities of the pituitary gland, go and stimulate it to either produce or to either inhibit its production. Then the communication also continues from the pituitary gland to the secondary gland or to the sub gland, for the sub gland to also act. Is that okay? And that forms something we call an axis in endocrine system. We have something we call hormonal axis. Okay, and that is the next thing we are going to look at. So we have the hormonal connection between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the distant gland, such as the thyroid glands, the gonads, and then the adrenal cortex, is called an axis. So that kind of hormonal connection, because you see, the hypothalamus is the master gland. So there is a hormonal connection. It's like you have a friend. You have, let's say, two friends. Okay, and the two friends, let's say you are more like their superior. Is that okay? You are more like their superior. Or you are in an office. You are more like the superior person. Then you are able to send, okay, you are more like superior person overseeing about two people under you. Okay, then when you give an order, it first goes to the first person. Then the first person too would go and release that information to someone else to also do something. So it tells you that there is this kind of connection. Okay, something like that in that scenario, or in that description that I've given, also happens in the endocrine system. And we call that an axis. Okay, so the hormonal connection between, so more like there is a hormonal connection between the hypothalamus and then, the pituitary gland to the distant glands. That kind of hormonal connection, we call it an axis. Okay, so the hormonal connection between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the distant glands like the thyroid gland, the gonads, the adrenal cortex, that kind of connection, we call it an axis. We have several axes in the endocrine system. Okay, we have the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. We have the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. We have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, so it tells you, so if you look at the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, it means that the hormonal connection from the hypothalamus releasing a certain hormone to go and control the thyroid stimulating hormone in the pituitary gland. Then the pituitary gland also releases the thyroid stimulating hormone to go and, influence the thyroid gland to also work. When you come to the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, the hypothalamus releases a certain hormone to go and stimulate a certain hormone in the pituitary gland. Then that hormone too will go and stimulate the gonads to also act in a certain way. So that kind of hormonal connection, okay, hormonal connection from the top to the pituitary gland to the down or the distance gland is what we call the hormonal connection. It's what we call the axis. Okay, and we have several of that connections. Okay, so we have the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. Okay, we have the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And then we have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Let's look at this in this diagram. So you see, this is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We have the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Okay, good. And then this is the thyroid axis. And we have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Is that okay? So you see, I mentioned that we have several of these axes in the endocrine system. So let's look at the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. And if we ask you to come and explain the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, you should be able to explain it. You should be able to explain. So you see, in these axes too, they use the negative feedback mechanism. All these axes, most of them use the negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so for example, see, there's the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. Okay, so you see, it starts from the hypothalamus. That's why we say hypothalamic. So the thyroid axis. So the hypothalamus releases the thyrotropin releasing hormone. You see, thyrotropin releasing hormone will go and stimulate the thyroid cells in the in the pituitary gland, then the thyrotrophs cells will also release thyroid stimulating hormone. Then the thyroid stimulating hormone will go to the thyroid gland, go and stimulate the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. And when we have dominance of the T3 and T4, T3, T4 will go and stimulate the target tissues, the heart, the liver, the bone, and the central nervous system. If T3 and T4 are also dominated, this negative feedback will be sent to the hypothalamus. Then the hypothalamus will decrease their release. Then the pituitary gland activity too will be decreased. That's why we say it uses the negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so the things start from here. So you see, the hypothalamus is releasing. Over here, I assume there is no negative stimulation. So you see that hypothalamus is releasing the thyrotropin releasing hormone. The hypothalamus is releasing over here, releasing the thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will go and stimulate the pituitary gland. Then the pituitary gland will also further release the thyroid stimulating hormone. Then the thyroid stimulating hormone also goes to the thyroid gland and stimulates the thyroid gland to produce their hormones. Thyroid gland produces the T4 and T3 and the calcitonin, okay, which acts on the heart muscles, the liver, the bone, and central nervous system. Then once we have a lot of T4 and T3, it sends a feedback back to the hypothalamus that no, these T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, they are dominating, okay, and that will cause the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland to negate. Meaning they will stop releasing. If you say negate in a gland, it means it has stopped working, or it will stop releasing. Is that okay? It will stop releasing the thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, good. So it uses the negative feedback mechanism to regulate the communication between the axes. Okay, and this is what we call the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. The same thing applies to the hypothalamic, pituitary gonadal axis. Okay, so you see the hypothalamus basically releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Then gonadotropin releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, or basically the pituitary gland, to go and stimulate the release of what? Luteinizing hormone and then follicle stimulating hormone. Then once follicle stimulating hormone is released, it goes to the gonads. If it is a male, the testes. If it's a female, the ovaries. Then it stimulates it to also produce estrogen and progesterone. Same thing applies here. When these hormones also dominate, then it sends a negative signal back to the hypothalamus for the release to be negated. Okay, so you see here the release has been negated. Here too, if the hypothalamus releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, or basically the pituitary gland, to go and stimulate it to release luteinizing hormone and follicle releasing hormone, stimulating hormone. Then follicle stimulating hormone to the female side goes to the ovary to go and stimulate the ovary to produce estrogen and progesterone. When estrogen and progesterone dominate, they send a negative signal back to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Then it negates their activity. Okay, and this is what we call the axis, more like a hormonal connection between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and distance gland. So that kind of hormonal connection between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and distance gland, that is what we call axis. We call it axis. So if you are asked what is an axis in an anatomy question, is the hormonal connection between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and then distance glands in endocrine system. That is what we call the axis. And we've discussed about 3 different axes: the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, and then the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Is that okay? Good. Now let's look at a summary of the pituitary gland hormones, or a summary of the hormones produced by the pituitary gland, their target cells, and then their functions. Okay, just as we did for the hypothalamus. Okay, now let's look at these hormones. So these are the hormones produced. In fact, remember that there are 2 very hormones in the posterior pituitary. They are not produced there. Okay, good. The posterior pituitary gland hormones are not produced there. They are stored and released there, but they are not produced there. Okay, so let's be mindful of that. So these are the hormones produced by the pituitary gland. we have the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. They are produced and secreted. They are produced, stored, and secreted in the anterior pituitary. Okay, the luteinizing hormone. They are produced, stored, and released or secreted by the posterior pituitary. The thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. They are produced, stored, and released from the anterior pituitary. Okay, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, the ACTH. They are produced, stored, and released from the anterior pituitary. The growth hormone, GH. They are produced, stored, and released from the anterior pituitary. The prolactin. Prolactin is also produced, stored, and released from the anterior pituitary. But these very hormones, they are just stored and released. They are not produced over here. They are produced by, so you see, they are produced by the hypothalamus. But because they are stored over here, if you are talking about hormones produced in the pituitary gland, you mention them because they are stored and released from there. So if you are talking about, you are talking about in terms of its storage and production, storage and release, then you can mention that they are stored and released from the posterior pituitary, but they are not produced in the posterior pituitary. Is that okay? Good. So now let's look at their functions. So for follicle stimulating hormone, okay, FSH, their target gland or organ is the ovaries. In the ovaries, their specific target cell is the granulosa cells for the females, and then for males is the Sertoli cells in males. Is that okay? So this very hormone, it targets the ovaries and the testes. So in females, it targets the ovaries, and in the ovaries, the specific cell in the ovary it targets is the granulosa cells in the females. And then for males, it targets the testes. The specific cell it targets in males is the Sertoli cells in males. And once it's able to stimulate these cells, okay, what happens is for females, it will stimulate ovarian follicle growth, follicular growth, or follicle growth, and estrogen secretion. And then for males, it stimulates and promotes spermatogenesis. Okay, so that means if it stimulates the ovaries and then ends up activating the granulosa cells into activity or into action, it stimulates ovarian follicular growth and estrogen secretion. But when it targets the testis as an organ or a gland and stimulates the activity of the Sertoli cells in the testis, it's going to promote spermatogenesis. Okay, good. Now, luteinizing hormone, LH. This hormone is also produced in the anterior pituitary, and this hormone also targets the ovaries and testes. This hormone is also targets the ovaries and testes. In the ovaries, specifically, it targets the theca cells in females, and in males, it targets the Leydig cells in males. Okay, now in females, when it targets the ovaries and then the theca cells in females, it triggers ovulation and corpus luteum formation. In females, in males, when it targets the testes and then specifically the Leydig cells in the males, it stimulates testosterone production. Okay, so you realize that it's this very hormone that stimulates testosterone production in males. So the luteinizing hormone produced in the anterior pituitary stimulates or targets the testes in males. When it targets the testes in males, specifically the Leydig cells in the testes, then this Leydig cells stimulates the testosterone production. But for females, it targets the ovaries, this luteinizing hormone, and when it targets the ovaries, specifically the theca cells in the ovaries, then when this is activated into action, it triggers ovulation and corpus luteum formation. That is what we are talking about. Okay, corpus luteum formation. Then now we have the thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone specifically targets the thyroid gland. Okay, it targets the thyroid gland, specifically the follicular cells and the parafollicular cells. Okay, also called the C cells in the thyroid gland. And that will basically stimulate the synthesis and release of thyroid hormones, the T3 and T4, which regulate metabolism and also stimulates the secretion of calcitonin, which plays a role in lowering your blood calcium levels. Okay, then we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone. The target gland or organ is the adrenal cortex. Specifically in the adrenal cortex, it targets the zona fasciculata because the adrenal cortex also have so many cells, but specifically it targets the zona fasciculata. Okay, and when it targets the zona fasciculata, it will stimulate this adrenal gland to stimulate cortisol release, to release cortisol, which is involved in stress response, metabolism, and immune regulation. Okay, now growth hormone, which is also produced in the anterior pituitary, it targets the liver, bones, muscles, and tissues. Okay, and the specific target cells in the liver is the hepatocytes. Is that okay? And then for bones, we have the chondrocytes. Muscles, we have the myocytes. Is that okay? And it promotes tissue growth, tissue repair, protein synthesis, lipolysis, and blood glucose regulation. Then prolactin, which is also produced in the anterior pituitary. This hormone actually targets the mammary gland in females, and then the testes in males. Okay, good. And the specific cell in the mammary gland that it influences is the mammary alveolar cells, and for males it stimulates the Leydig cells, but then its impact on males has a minor effect. Now, in all, this prolactin, when it stimulates the mammary gland, would help stimulate breast milk production in females and may also influence the testosterone in males. Okay, then the last hormones, which are actually that relating to the posterior pituitary. These hormones are not produced in the pituitary gland or the posterior pituitary. They are just stored there. The antidiuretic hormone and then oxytocin. In fact, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, the target gland or organ is the kidneys and your blood vessels. Okay. In fact, the specific target cells in the kidney is the principal cells of collecting that and vascular smooth muscles. In fact, when this hormone is released and come to stimulate this very target gland or organs, okay, it will promote water reabsorption, vasoconstriction to release blood pressure, to increase your blood pressure in a situation where your blood pressure is very low. Then now the last is oxytocin. Okay, in fact, this oxytocin, the target gland or organ is the uterus, the mammary gland, and then the brain. Is that okay? And the specific cells in these very glands that it targets is the cells in the uterine smooth muscles and the myoepithelial cells. Now, when these cells are stimulated, at the end of the day, what will happen is it will stimulate uterine contractions during labor, milk ejection during breastfeeding, and it's involved in social bonding. That is the oxytocin. Okay, that is the oxytocin. So the hormone that is involved in social bonding is also oxytocin. Is that okay? Good. So that is the summary of the pituitary gland hormones, their targets, and then their functions. So remember that these are the hormones produced and stored in the pituitary gland. Okay, so for the anterior pituitary, we have follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. These are the anterior pituitary gland hormones. These hormones are produced in the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so they are produced, stored, and released in the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary. But these two, okay, they are stored and released in the posterior pituitary, but they are not produced there. Okay, so over here we have the hormone in the pituitary gland. Okay, which part of the pituitary gland secretes it, and which organ or gland will it target? When it targets, which specific cell within this gland will it stimulate? And that is what we have over here in this column. Then when it stimulates that cell, what function will be produced in the body? Okay, good. So this is a summary of the pituitary gland hormones. In fact, this brings us to the end of the pituitary gland. In our next video, we will look at the thyroid gland. Okay, we will look at the thyroid gland. So now we are done with the master regulator and then the master gland. So in summary, the pituitary gland is referred to as the master gland or the hypophysis. You can also call it the hypophysis. Okay, but it is often referred to as the master gland because it controls the activities of many other distant endocrine glands or organs. This gland is about 1.3 centimeters in diameter. Okay, enlarging up to 50% when a woman is pregnant. It is located at the base of the brain, housed in a bony cavity called the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And this is very, significant in anatomy. It's something that you have to know in anatomy. It is suspended from the hypothalamus by a stalk known as the infundibulum, forming a critical connection in neuroendocrine system. And we mentioned this gland consists of two parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis because there is a blood vessel connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. That's why we can also call it the adenohypophysis. Adenohypophysis. Okay, good. And then we have a neural connection between the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Because of that, we call it the neurohypophysis. Is that okay? Good. So in summary, this brings us to the end of the pituitary gland anatomy and physiology. Thank you so much for your time. Kindly subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed to it so that anytime a video is uploaded, you'll be notified. Okay, and make sure you like this video and share content on this channel to families and friends who may find this information or this content very useful. Thank you so much.